I observe as 2025 closes that the conflict which Western institutional discourse framed in February 2022 as an existential battle between democracy and autocracy has transformed into something its architects did not publicly anticipate, a war of attrition with no defined victory condition, no clear termination mechanism, and no remaining consensus about what success would even mean. This is not a deviation from plan. It is the revelation of what happens when the rhetorical capacities of institutional power exceed its material and strategic capacities, and when a proxy conflict against a nuclear-armed state is sustained not by coherent strategy, but by the political impossibility of admitting miscalculation. I trace this not as a narrative of battlefield events, which remain subordinate to structural forces, but as a case study in how the US-led institutional order manages, or fails to manage, its first major conventional proxy war against a peer nuclear competitor since the Cold War ended. What I document is not Russian success or Ukrainian failure, but the exposure of NATO's institutional limits, the gap between its financial dominance and its industrial atrophy, between its rhetorical unity and its members' divergent material interests, between its ability to impose costs and its inability to define achievable ends. The stalemate is not a temporary condition awaiting resolution. It is the equilibrium that emerges when maximalist objectives meet structural constraints and when the political costs of both escalation and negotiation exceed what any major actor is willing to bear. I begin with the rhetorical transformation because it reveals the institutional logic. In 2022, the framing was unambiguous. Ukraine would win, Russia would collapse, sanctions would devastate the Russian economy, and Western military aid would enable a decisive Ukrainian counteroffensive that would restore territorial integrity and demonstrate the superiority of the liberal order. By mid-2023, after the counteroffensive failed to achieve breakthrough, the language shifted. Ukraine must not lose. Russia must be weakened, sanctions are a long-term strategy, and Western support will continue as long as it takes. By late 2024 and into 2025, the frame has mutated again. Ukraine needs a just peace, negotiations are inevitable, territorial compromises may be necessary, and Western aid is conditional on realistic military objectives. This is not strategic adaptation, it is the linguistic management of failure, the gradual lowering of expectations to align with what is materially possible while preserving the claim that institutional credibility remains intact. I analyze the ammunition crisis because it exposes the material foundation beneath the rhetoric. NATO states, particularly the United States and European Union members, discovered in 2023 what should have been evident from the beginning. They had deindustrialized their defense production base during the post-Cold War decades, outsourcing manufacturing, closing factories, and assuming that precision technology could substitute for mass production. Ukraine's artillery consumption rates, thousands of shells per day, revealed that Western stockpiles were measured in weeks, not years, and that ramping up production would require not just funding, but the reconstruction of supply chains, workforce training, and factory capacity that had been dismantled. The United States committed to producing 100,000 artillery shells per month by late 2025. Russia was already producing approximately 250,000 per month by mid-2024, using an industrial base that had never been fully dismantled and a wartime economy structure that prioritizes military output over consumer goods. This is not a temporary gap. It is a structural asymmetry that reveals how financialized service-based economies struggle to sustain attritional conflicts that require mass industrial output. I examine the European fracture, which Western media frames as Hungarian or Slovak obstruction, but which reflects deeper material realities. Germany, the EU's industrial core, has seen energy costs rise dramatically since the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed and Russian gas imports ceased, undermining its manufacturing competitiveness and generating political pressure to seek accommodation with Russia or alternative energy partnerships. Poland and the Baltic states, perceiving existential threat, demand indefinite support for Ukraine and deeper NATO forward deployment, even as their own defense spending strains national budgets. France seeks strategic autonomy and a European security architecture less dependent on U.S. leadership, but lacks the military-industrial capacity to actualize this vision. Hungary and Slovakia, facing economic contraction and populist domestic pressures, openly call for negotiations and the restoration of economic ties with Russia. This is not ideological division. It is the reassertion of national interest when the costs of sustained proxy conflict become domestically unaffordable, and when the probability of achieving stated objectives approaches zero. I trace the Global South's systematic non-alignment, which NATO institutional discourse frames as cowardice or corruption, but which represents a rational calculation about the emerging international order. India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and the majority of African states refused to join Western sanctions, continued or expanded trade with Russia, and abstained from UN resolutions condemning the invasion, not because they endorse Russian actions, but because they recognize that a world where the US and EU can unilaterally freeze foreign reserves, exclude states from financial systems, and weaponize the dollar is a world where their own sovereignty is contingent on Western approval. The seizure of Russian central bank assets established a precedent. If reserves held in Western financial institutions can be confiscated based on geopolitical alignment, then those reserves are not assets but hostages. The Global South observed this and accelerated de-dollarization efforts, alternative payment systems, and deeper integration with Chinese and Russian-led institutional frameworks. The proxy war in Ukraine, intended to isolate Russia and demonstrate Western power, instead accelerated the very multipolarity that Western institutional dominance sought to prevent. I dissect the quiet rhetorical shift from total victory to negotiated settlement as the 2026 U.S. presidential election cycle intensifies, because it reveals the domestic political constraints that override strategic coherence. The Biden administration's framing of unlimited support was always conditional on domestic political sustainability, but by late 2024, polling showed declining public support for open-ended aid, Republican opposition intensifying, and Democratic candidates distancing themselves from the conflict's costs. The Trump campaign explicitly called for immediate negotiations and an end to U.S. funding, while other Republican candidates proposed capping aid or conditioning it on European burden sharing. This is not isolationism, it is the reassertion of domestic political economy over foreign policy abstraction. The U.S. public, facing inflation, housing costs, and infrastructure deficits, increasingly questions why billions flow to Ukraine while domestic needs remain unmet. The institutional answer, that supporting Ukraine defends the liberal order, has lost persuasive force because the liberal order's benefits are no longer self-evident to populations experiencing wage stagnation, deindustrialization, and social fragmentation. I examine the normalization of nuclear threshold proximity, which may be the conflict's most dangerous structural legacy. Russia has repeatedly referenced nuclear doctrine, conducted strategic exercises, and positioned tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. The United States and NATO have dismissed these as bluffs, crossed Russian-declared red lines through long-range missile supplies, F-16 deliveries, and intelligence sharing, and publicly stated that nuclear use would provoke overwhelming conventional response. This iterative process has normalized what was previously unthinkable. The routine discussion of nuclear weapons use in a European conflict, the gradual erosion of the taboo that has prevented their use since 1945, and the establishment of a precedent that nuclear powers can engage in extended proxy wars against each other without triggering direct confrontation. The risk is not that intentional nuclear use becomes likely. It is that the probability of miscalculation, accident, or uncontrolled escalation increases with every month the conflict continues, and that the institutional mechanisms designed to prevent such escalation have atrophied during this process. I trace what a frozen conflict outcome reveals about European security architecture. If the war concludes with a ceasefire along current lines, Russia holding Crimea, Donbass, and land bridge territories, Ukraine retaining majority of its pre-2022 territory but without NATO membership or security guarantees, then Europe faces a permanent instability zone requiring indefinite military presence, economic support, and political management. Ukraine becomes a failed state project, economically devastated, depopulated by refugee outflows exceeding 5 million, dependent on external funding that European states struggle to sustain, and unable to achieve either EU integration due to corruption and governance deficits or reconstruction due to ongoing insecurity and destroyed infrastructure. Russia remains under sanctions but adapts through import substitution, Asian partnerships, and economic reorientation toward China and India. NATO faces the question it has avoided. Does it extend Article 5 guarantees to Ukraine, risking direct war with Russia over future border incidents, or does it maintain strategic ambiguity, rendering the alliance's eastward expansion meaningless as a security guarantee? The frozen conflict does not resolve the European security dilemma. It perpetuates it in a form that drains resources, sustains regional instability, and prevents the economic integration that European prosperity depends upon. I analyze the institutional credibility costs that accumulate regardless of how the conflict ends. If Russia retains conquered territory, the principle that borders cannot be changed by force, the supposed foundation of the post-1945 order, is revealed as selectively enforced based on power differentials, not universal law. If Ukraine is pressured into territorial concessions to end Western aid dependency, the narrative that the West stands with democracies against aggression collapses, and every future target of great power expansion will conclude that Western support is rhetorical, not material, and evaporates when costs exceed political tolerance. If the conflict continues indefinitely as a frozen stalemate, NATO's inability to achieve stated objectives becomes undeniable, and the gap between its proclaimed power and its actual capacity to shape outcomes widens. The institutional order's legitimacy rests on the claim that it defends sovereignty, deters aggression, and rewards alignment with liberal norms. The Ukraine conflict has demonstrated that these claims hold only when challenging them is cheap, and collapse when enforcement requires sustained material sacrifice. I examine whether U.S. institutional commitment can survive electoral volatility because this conflict has exposed the fragility of bipartisan consensus in American foreign policy. The Cold War consensus persisted because Soviet threat was perceived as existential and because domestic prosperity allowed foreign policy costs to remain politically invisible to median voters. Neither condition holds today. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It lacks ideological appeal, economic scale comparable to the USSR, or global revolutionary ambitions that threaten American domestic stability. China, the genuine peer competitor, is not directly involved in Ukraine, and diverting resources to Europe weakens U.S. strategic focus and military capacity in the Indo-Pacific theater, where long-term competition will determine hegemonic outcomes. Domestically, the U.S. faces mounting deficits, debt service costs approaching discretionary spending levels, and infrastructure decay that make foreign aid politically toxic when framed as discretionary spending divorced from tangible national interest. The Trump presidency demonstrated that 4 years is sufficient to reverse decades of policy commitments. If a similar administration takes power in 2025, there is no institutional mechanism to ensure continued Ukraine support, regardless of strategic arguments from foreign policy establishments. I return to the core structural question: why has this stalemate emerged, and what does it reveal about the actual function of proxy warfare in contemporary geopolitics? The answer is not Russian military excellence or Ukrainian incompetence. It is the reassertion of material limits over financial and rhetorical power. NATO can impose sanctions, but Russia adapted its economy, reoriented trade flows, and maintained GDP growth through energy exports to non-Western markets. NATO can provide weapons, but industrial production capacity determines sustainability in attritional warfare, and Western defense industries optimized for profit margins cannot rapidly scale to wartime production levels. NATO can offer intelligence and training, but it cannot compensate for manpower deficits when Ukraine's mobilization pool shrinks and Russia can sustain casualties that Western publics would find politically intolerable. The stalemate reveals that economic dominance does not automatically translate into military victory, that technology cannot substitute for mass when attrition is the operative dynamic, and that a nuclear-armed state fighting on its perceived security borders will accept costs that intervening powers, fighting for geopolitical abstraction rather than survival, will not sustain. I conclude with the systemic implications. The Ukraine conflict is not an isolated event. It is a test case for how the US-led institutional order manages great power competition in an emerging multipolar environment. The lessons being learned are not those Western institutions intended to teach. Regional powers observe that nuclear weapons provide immunity from regime change operations. Middle powers observe that non-alignment offers more strategic flexibility than alliance dependence on unreliable hegemons. Economic powers observe that financial weaponization accelerates de-dollarization and the creation of parallel institutional architectures. Military planners observe that attritional warfare favors industrial depth over technological sophistication. What emerges is not the strengthening of the liberal international order, but its fragmentation into competing blocs, each drawing different conclusions from the same conflict. The institutional order marketed itself as the guarantor of peace, prosperity, and sovereignty. The Ukraine conflict has revealed it as a mechanism for managing hegemonic decline, externalizing costs onto proxy states, and preserving hierarchy through selective enforcement of principles it claims as universal. The question is not whether Ukraine wins or loses. It is whether the institutional structures that framed this conflict as existential can survive the revelation of their limits. I observe that they cannot, not because they will collapse suddenly, but because legitimacy, once lost, cannot be restored through rhetoric alone, and the gap between what these institutions promise and what they can deliver widens with every month the stalemate continues. The system that produced this conflict is not reforming. It is exposing itself, and the exposure is structural, not temporary.